Welcome to this exciting joint seminar hosted by the University of Toronto and Toronto's Edwin S.H. Leong Centre for Healthy Children, together with the University of British Columbia's Edwin S.H. Leong Centre for Healthy Aging. I'm Eyal Cohen, co-director of the Leong Centre for Healthy Children. It's my distinct pleasure to open today's session. I'd like to open by acknowledging that at least at this Leong Centre, at the University of Toronto and the Hospital for Sick Children, we are located on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And it's a pleasure to live here and work here. And we recognize and honor the Indigenous peoples who've cared for this land for thousands of years. And it's a pleasure to partner with the Leong Centre on one of Canada's three coasts, and to acknowledge that from coast to coast to coast, we have a proud history of ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. For those of you who haven't been to one of the joint sessions, we are at opposite ends of the age spectrum in the two Leong centers, the one in British Columbia and the one in Ontario. And we really try to emphasize in some of these joint seminars shared learning for life course thinking about health. And there is no topic of there are very few topics of greater importance, or many topics of importance, but this is certainly one of them that is relevant across the life course as much as the concept of promoting physical activity, and really also a really salient topic for introducing thinking about how we apply precision medicine approaches and precision approaches in research to groups, really the concept of precision public health. And it's a pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Marc Beauchamp, who is a professor of exercise and health psychology in the School of Kinesiology at UBC. His work centers on understanding barriers to and facilitators of health-enhancing physical activity across the age spectrum and developing and evaluating physical activity interventions with various populations. So I shout out to Dr. Beauchamp for coming today, and a virtual welcome to everyone across the country and beyond who are joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Beauchamp.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Eyal. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're here in Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and certainly we're very grateful and appreciative to live and play and work on these lands. So there's a lot of interest in the effectiveness and implementation of precision medicine approaches, as Eyal highlighted, to both treatment and prevention. And as many of you will know, precision medicine takes into consideration individual variability in people's biology and the context in which they live, as well as their personal lifestyle factors, with the goal being to allow physicians and healthcare specialists and researchers alike to predict more accurately which treatment and prevention strategies for a particular disease will work in which groups of people. Advances in screening based on family histories and identification of genetic variants associated with disease onset have resulted in really marked improvements in prevention for specific at-risk populations. And such assessments have resulted in tailored therapies that are designed to treat specific conditions based on personal, biological, and genetic markers. Now, although precision medicine interventions with respect to prevention and treatment have primarily focus on the use of genomic and other biological sort of microbiomics, metabolomics, and so on, in terms of other biological data to provide better and more personalized care. There have also been concerted efforts to screen for social risk factors within clinical settings. And broadly conceived, social risk factors focus on individual level adverse social determinants of health. And so from a precision medicine perspective, assessments of social risk factors include indices of unemployment or food insecurity, intimate partner violence, quality of housing, difficulty affording medication, and so on. And this approach is well justified, given that social risk factors have consistently been identified as contributing to a range of health behaviors and disease outcomes. Critically, however, where consideration of social risk factors falls short is that it fails to capture the social groups to which people belong, and in particular, their identification with those social groups. Now, there's a growing body of powerful psychological driver of human behavior. And so from a precision medicine perspective, this process of social identification can provide an invaluable foundation for developing and implementing bespoke interventions, especially for hard to reach or marginalized populations. And of note, these approaches can also be delivered at scale. So what I'll try and do in this talk is make the case for how groups can be used to uniquely tap into people's social identities to support sustained involvement in health-enhancing physical activity, and thereafter various physical and mental health benefits as a form of group-mediated precision medicine. Anyway, see what you think. As always, I welcome questions and critique, and we'll see how this unfolds. So in terms of the consequences of physical inactivity, these are well known, and we'll not go into the epidemiology of this. But what we can take as given is that physical activity has increased alarmingly over the past century. It's a major cause of premature mortality and associated with a number of preventable unhealthy conditions. Now, in terms of looking at the understanding the potential contribution of groups, we'll go to some of Charles Darwin's earlier writing on the origin of species, when he wrote that with those animals which were benefited by living in close association, the individuals which took the greatest pleasure in society would best escape various challenges, while those that cared least for their comrades and lived in solitary would perish in greater numbers. Quite dramatic language at the end, but it really does get across the notion that groups matter. So in terms of physical activity and adherence, what do the data point towards? So in this prominent meta-analysis by the late Bert Caron and his colleagues, found that when people were active or exercised with others rather than alone, they adhered to a greater extent. But of course, not all groups are the same. And when we see cohesive groups in particular, those members adhered to an even greater extent. And I'll come back to specific ways in which social identification can be harnessed. But this was a meta-analysis that looked to understand the effects of social identification into building interventions, those that sought to harness people's social identities using randomized controlled trials. And what you'll look at the effects, if we reflect on Cohen's criteria, 0.2 being small, 0.5 being a medium effect, and 0.8 being large. When we look at these indices, quality of life, physical health, self-esteem, well-being, reduced anxiety, reduced depression, improvements in cognitive health, and reduced stress. All of these effects are in the medium to large effect size range. So in terms of understanding social identities, how these come about, well, first, in essence, people need to get some sense of the extent to which a collection or an entity of people, a group like, and they make inferences on the basis of a whole number of social categorizations, whether it's age, gender, ethnicity, weight status, occupation, and so on. And people reflect on the extent to which they're similar to others within their own groups, while also making inferences about how different they may be to other groups. And when people do hold these identities as being salient and important to them, people are more likely to be attached to the group. So those groups display higher levels of cohesion. And when they're more cohesive, they obviously stick with those groups, and then they thereafter derive improvements in physical activity, mental health outcomes, and so on. And just to note that green box at the top, what it also points towards is that identity leaders, whether it's coaches or physicians and so on, can play a major role in making a particular group seem meaningful to those with the potential to be involved. So this is a non-physical activity study, but I think it really highlights, the potential of groups to really operate through this group-mediated precision medicine approach. So this is this paper by Victor and colleagues in the New England Journal of Medicine. And these are really highly innovative form of intervention to reduce blood pressure amongst a hard-to-reach population, so African-American men, by delivering the intervention via barbershops that were augmented with medication management by specially trained pharmacists. process. The researchers compared this to an active control in which the barbers encouraged lifestyle modification and doctor appointments, and they found that both cohort retention was 95%. It's very high in the augmented barbershop condition, with participants also displaying larger reductions in blood pressure than the active control. And although this wasn't set up as a social identity informed intervention, in their appraisal of it, the authors noted that the intervention was tailored to Black men and endorsed by participating barbers who were trusted community members, and whereby participants were loyal patrons of those barbershops. So in terms of the effects, if the primary outcome was systolic blood pressure, but if you look at systolic and diastolic blood pressure and changes of millimeters of mercury, here you see clinically meaningful reductions in an objective health outcome, in this case, blood pressure. Not a physical activity adherence study, but I think this really points to the power of groups. So this was run by a single-authored postdoc while she was at Stanford, and now based in Egypt. And they ran a social cohesion interventions in post-ISIS Iraq, and her study was on the front cover of Science. And in this study, Iraqi Christians displaced by the Islamic State were randomized to an all-Christian soccer team or to a mixed team mixed with Muslims. And what they found, among other things, so they ran this as a soccer or sport physical activity program. And what they found that the intervention improved behaviors towards the Muslims. And in quite a divisive world in which we live, I thought this finding was really quite profound. And what they found, among other things, was that Christians with Muslim teammates were more likely to vote for a Muslim not on their team, to receive their a sportsmanship award, and register for a mixed team next season and train with Muslims 6 months after the intervention. So how about physical activity? Well, here's a paper recently published in The Lancet, and these in the top left-hand corner with the red figures, we've got males, and at the bottom females, but to really look at this on a global basis, because the patterns are reflected across the globe, and in every arena across the world, in every culture continent, we see that people become less active as they age. And so this obviously ties to my interest in the Leong Centre here at UBC in Vancouver. And my interest really became piqued by some initial work that was coming out of Stanford, which was asking older adults about their preferences to exercise alone or with others. And what Abby King's group were finding quite repeatedly was that older adults were ostensibly reporting a preference to exercise alone. And so they then started developing home-based personalized intervention. And obviously preferences matter. And I just found that very interesting at the time. And I saw this as really three paradoxes. And the first is, why would people choose a context when two prominent theories or major theories in psychology provide conceptual empirical evidence that being with others is more innately natural than being alone? And also, when you look at younger adults, they also show a preference for more social contexts. And lastly, when people do exercise with others, especially in groups that are cohesive, the levels of adherence are markedly superior than when they exercise alone. So I thought this is interesting. Why would older adults prefer a context that's less innately natural, least likely to be preferred by younger adults, and less likely to sustain their long-term adherence? And reflecting on this really tied me to this notion, some of the research and theory around social identity, and really what social identity could be summed up with through this picture, this adage of birds of a feather flocking together. And it raised the question for me, do older birds of a feather stay active together? So to try and get at this question, we took a similar, and what I've done, thanks to Dr. Kaylee McGuire, my postdoc, who's put these QR codes in. So if you're interested in any of these publications, or do an immediate fact check to see if I'm out to lunch or not, but I've included some of the key papers in there through these QR codes. So in this paper, we looked at the same question that the group at Stanford did, but we asked it slightly differently. So we sampled people across the age spectrum, from those in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s and up. And in terms of their preferences to exercise alone, there are no differences across those groups. But when we asked people in their 20s and 30s, perhaps unsurprisingly, they had a strong preference to exercise with those their own age, but a dislike to exercise with others. And when we asked those in their 40s and 50s, again, they have a preference to exercise with those their own age, and a dislike especially for working with older adults. And then lastly, and this was particularly germane and interesting for me, is that it wasn't that older adults dislike groups. They really do like groups. It's just they like working out in groups made up of other older adults, and a dislike for exercising in classes made up with younger people. At the time that a paper came out in the Annals of Behavioral Medicine, a group of older men in the North Shore and West Vancouver phoned me up and said, "Hey, do you know what we're doing here?" And obviously I was curious, and I spoke with them, and they invited me over. And what was interesting, they had levels of adherence that I'd never seen in any other program. They'd had 40% that had been at this program for 10 or more years, and 70% that had been adherent for 5 years or more. As you can see from the photo, there's a very homogenous group, very high income status, very white as well, not a whole lot of diversity in terms of ethnicity. So I was curious as to the extent to which we could take this concept in terms of having an older adult program run by older adults, and also saw, rather than just physical activity as the endpoint, but using physical activity as a hook to get people to socially connect afterwards. So we got funding from CIHR and ran this group-based physical activity for older adults trial. I still don't know how we managed to squeeze the acronym GOAL into that, but I guess as psychologists, that's what we do. Anyway, so we ran this as a 3-arm randomized trial, pre-registered the hypotheses, the analyses, and there were 3 conditions. And in each condition, these older adults, 65 and up, were assigned to conditions where if they adhered, they would be meeting Canada's guidelines. So 3 bouts of 50 to 60 minutes a week. And the 3 conditions were this. So similar age, so older adults with other older adults, same gender, so men with men, women with women, similar age, mixed gender, so older adults together, but mixed gender. And then we had a standard comparison condition where these older adults could select any group-based program offered by the Y, trained or led by expert Y instructors, whereas in our programs, they were volunteer older adults who we trained. It was a 6-month trial. We provided quite extensive training for these instructors. So these were volunteers. They were not experts, and I think it's worth highlighting that. We tailored the music to music that older adults would prefer. We had a more strenuous version of each activity and a low-intensity version that every adult could adopt. And then instructors could stitch together these different exercises. And here was one class they called Spectacular Backsize, and there were various other names given to these classes. So there was any number of combinations that these older adult instructors could use with their participants. So in terms of the primary outcome, so first, the findings were invariant across gender, so no differences between men and women. And here we have the same age, mixed gender, same age, same gender, statistically no significant differences. Means were higher for the same age, mixed gender, and comparison to the control equated to a 10 hours difference in physical activity over 6 months. So not a trivial amount, an effect size in the medium effect size range. So the findings were interesting on several folds. One, it actually highlighted that attending to groups on the basis of single or same gender didn't make a difference. And in fact, the overall, the means were higher in the mixed gender classes, but age does matter, and it did matter here. What was, we also were interested in looking at the trajectories and looking at mediators. So shortly after assignment, we found this is a measure of group cohesion. And in the 2 social identity informed conditions, cohesion started high 2 weeks after they were assigned and continued to increase. We also were interested in testing mediation. So we ran a cross-lag panel mediation model. And then here we found that social cohesion accounted for or explained the effects of the intervention into the social identity intervention conditions on physical activity adherence over the course of 12 weeks and 24 weeks. What was also, I think, particularly interesting when we think of knowledge mobilization, knowledge translation, after we finished the study, but before we'd analyzed the data, I had a journalist from the Vancouver Sun phone me up and said, "Have you heard what's happening in the Y?" And I'm hoping that hopefully nothing bad's happened and things are good. And anyway, they proceed to tell me that the older adults who'd taken part in their group-based programs, their goal programs, initially they thought those programs were continue, and then the Y reverted back to their usual offerings, and they ended up petitioning and demanding that their goal-based programs were continued to be offered after the programs ended. And I think it points to the importance of advocacy, but also there is real interest in tailoring programs by older adults and for older adults. We also, early on in the COVID pandemic, we had some bridge funding from CIHR, and we saw an opportunity. Can we provide programs to support older adults and also to help support them being socially connected? In this, we put this together very, very quickly. I know many of us were doing these sorts of things at the time. We got adverts out in the local media, and we ran this as a 3-arm randomized trial pre-registered. We had virtual group-based conditions, so we ran the same as what we did in the GOLD trial, but online. And then we also had a personal exercise program, so same exercises, but there was no sense of us and groupness. And in the group conditions, they were encouraged to connect afterwards over coffee. In the in-person GOLD programs, the older adults would stick around for an hour and a half afterwards, drink coffee, connect, and so on. We tried to create that on Zoom, and then we had a waitlist control where they went through where they waited till the data were collected, then afterwards they could access either of the other 2 programs. So we ran this via Zoom. And in terms of effects, we saw this is a global measure of mental health, and we have a measure of physical health as well. We see some effects, but no differences between the personal and group-based condition at all. And I think, to my mind, even reflecting on this, so older adults who took part in this study, they appreciated the opportunity to be active, but they didn't stick around for the social connections. And there is something, and there is some data that points towards this about differences when you're connecting on Zoom and you're looking directly at everyone, and it's not quite the same if you're having a sort of coffee in a YMCA or a local community center. So I think this points to the sort of boundary conditions that online, I think it was a band-aid, at least for this study and this program at best, but there was no advantage, no substantive advantage for the group base above this individual program. What's noticed, well, though, there was interest in the older adult after the program ended. The program continued to be offered for a couple of years afterwards until things really moved back to normal. So I think it also points that if there are people who are geographically very remote and maybe can't access in-person programs for whatever reason, it's a potential alternative. So in terms of other hard-to-reach populations, so I'll discuss some. I'll try and give a bit of a flavor here for some of the work we've done and also work that others have done as well, which points to how groups can be used to harness these social identities to really support exercise adherence outcomes and mental well-being and so on. So this out of Dr. Don McKenzie, so cross-appointed in medicine and kinesiology recently, now an emeritus professor. And this editorial in CMAJ referred to him as Mr. Dragonboat. Perhaps it should have been Dr. Dragonboat. But what was interesting, what started off as a really unique program of research, so he was interested in this from a physician. And the thinking at the time was that if women with breast cancer exercise, it would exacerbate the potential for lymphedema, and physically it would be problematic. And so his hypothesis was around, well, actually physical activity might be beneficial. And they not only found it to be beneficial, but they also found by this shared experience of having gone through breast cancer together, that these women forged this unique bond. And dragon boating amongst breast cancer survivors is now operates across the planet and across continents. And this is a lovely quote right from their own, the Breast on a Boat organization website, where women comment that we are a living symbol of hope and a vivid demonstration that there is life after diagnosis. Through the strenuous demands of dragon boat paddling, we have learned that we can push the limits of our physical endurance and have fun doing it. This was a unique program out of Scotland, Kate Hunt and her colleagues, again published in the Lancet, and they were interested in harnessing identities tied towards being sports fans, in this case soccer fans. So they ran this as a gender-sensitized weight loss and healthy living program for overweight and obese men, and they delivered this at the stadia of Premier League football clubs. And they found, relative to a waitlist control, they found clinically meaningful reductions in weight loss, and those remained over the course of a year. We've done some different work. A former doctoral student of mine and his students in Australia, Ben Jackson, rather than actually going to a soccer club and taking part in education around diet and general physical activities, this was actually a soccer program where they actually played soccer itself. Started in the UK, but now running in Australia, and where men would get points both for scoring goals, as in soccer, but also for individual and collective weight loss. And so if we look at some of the effects of this, large effects on weight loss, improvements in physical activity, improvements in dietary intake, as well as mental health outcomes in terms of reductions in depression. This is work of Guy Faulkner and colleagues here at UBC, where they've tried to use running groups as a means of supporting both physical activity and also smoking cessation. And so over time, where these adults have these shared experiences, life histories of both being typically inactive and also smokers, but with an interest in becoming more healthy and more active over time. This is not a RCT, but a pre-post study with baseline reductions in smoker identity and also improvements in running identity. But what was interesting is that smoking identity, reductions in smoking identity accounted for a significant amount of variance in objective measures of smoking behavior through these smokerizers and reductions in carbon monoxide. And also improvements in running identity accounted for a significant variance in running frequency. And this is a quote. So this was a mixed method study that included both a quantitative part and a qualitative component. And this is one of the quotes from one of the participants who highlighted that the big thing for me was the group, especially combining the group with the run. So when you put the group and the running together, that was great. We've also done some work with military veterans here in Vancouver. So military veterans, after they leave the military, not all, but some will struggle with the transition, whether it's adjusting to civilian life, finding jobs, or their families adjusting to them. And so we saw an opportunity to support veterans through a very simple, easy to administer program. We pitched this simply as turn up, sweat, socially connect, and have fun. And there was no ulterior motive pitch to this. But what was really interesting is that by coming to these programs, and for some they were quite, not all, but some were disaffected after leaving the military. But when they came to the armory where this happened and they connected and played sport, they found that, oh, there are opportunities around education. There's also opportunities around counseling or veterans affairs support. So here's a quote from one of the participants who sort of, I thought it was just awesome, just being with a bunch of people with life experiences. I left the military and noticed that you don't really quite fit in right with civilian life. So being with a group of veterans, it's very helpful. And playing hockey was just the best ever. Quintessential Canadian comment, perhaps. Here's another from another participant who said that you can relate no matter what people do. You can always relate to them because you have service experience. You kind of have that camaraderie already before even meeting the person. It's kind of hard to explain. You feel more at home than you do just meeting random people. This is some work that Joe O'Rourke did with precariously housed homeless adults in Vancouver through the Vancouver Street Soccer League. Which involves or supports unsheltered, emergency sheltered, provisionally accommodated, and at-risk adults. So this is a qualitative study, and Joe, who's now in Toronto, but ran this right in the middle of the pandemic, and so doing this study was not a trivial endeavor, and so absolute commendation for Joe for leading on this. So a few things I just wanted to highlight. So in interviewing these participants, as a result of taking part in this program with other people with similar life experience, they reported feeling authentic and valued. They've reported being part of a supportive family. It felt like a family to them. And for some, it supported their recovery from overcoming illness and substance misuse, and also reducing stigma associated with being homeless. And also, they all had a stake in this. There was a shared notion of leadership. What I do want to highlight, though, that of course there are challenges with running these sorts of programs, and I've highlighted here one that was which became evident in this program. So which we've highlighted or described as this paradox of psychological safety. So by virtue of this program, participants felt connected and they felt bonded to others, but also what for some they felt that it allowed them to express their trauma, which can be quite distressing for others. And I'll just highlight a quote from one of the participants who said, some people bring their baggage to the field, and I'm the kind of person, like, what's between the lines is like between the lines, and the other shit just stays out. Like, I don't bring my trauma to the soccer field. I'll be having a bad day, but I'm not ranting and raving, because the thing is, now someone has to listen to someone else and others' pain, and that just makes me think, like, I came here to not think about the pain. And what this points towards in important lessons learned. So we shared this feedback, and what this does provide the VSSL is an opportunity to maybe look at how, in terms of what was fair game for discussion, but also in terms of a code of conduct for what should be discussed outside of the soccer setting, and what's reasonable and appropriate to be shared with others. So I'm mindful of both the Leong Centres, both in Vancouver and also Toronto. I know that I've spoken primarily about adults and older adults at the front end, but I do think there is potentially an opportunity if folks are interested in this to look at this with youth and children. There has been some work that's taking some of the idea of drawing from shared identities or shared experiences, maybe overweight and obese. Here's a study that was conducted in school settings. I'm not sure whether schools would be the best or maybe outside, but maybe there are some of the ideas might resonate that we've covered in this talk, because people are people, and some of the drivers around social identity, connection, and are certainly pervasive across the life course. So if folks are interested in chatting, I'm very happy to do so. So in terms of a few sort of final thoughts, I think this framework around harnessing social identities, the social identity approach, there's data, both quantitative data, randomized trials, some observational data, and also some qualitative work that really gets at the richness of this, that points to this as a useful, efficacious, informative framework that also can inform knowledge mobilization. And so hopefully I've made the case, and we'll see based on the feedback, that group-mediated precision medicine is possible by harnessing these social identities of various groups, especially marginalized groups, to help them retain their involvement in programs, in my case, in terms of my work with regard to physical activity, retention and maintenance, and also well-being. I'm also very mindful that virtually all of the work that I've undertaken today has been based in Western countries. And I think it's sort of behoove of all of us to think beyond weird. Weird not in a pejorative sense, but weird by virtue of Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. So that's the framework that Joe Henrich and others, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. And I think if we are doing some of this work and harnessing social identities, I think of Musa's work early on, that the study in post-ISIS Iraq, I think there is application of this to across the globe and not just in Western contexts. There will be challenges, but I think it's worth taking on those challenges. And hopefully for some, this is a starting point, piqued hopefully some interest among some. May be happy to follow up with conversations. Obviously, I'm mindful of the challenges with doing this by distance, but I think it's also one of the great aspects of this that we can do this across campuses. So with that, I'm happy to end, and there's my email if you want to follow up. I'm happy to connect with folks, and on that, I will end it right there, which I hope is around time.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Beauchamp. And I think we got lots of time for questions and comments. My only ask is if anyone has just to introduce yourself, because we're a pretty diverse group on at the seminar. Maybe I'll start. Mark, I thought it's really fascinating, the comment you made about the post-ISIS Iraq study. And the benefits in terms of having diversity in social settings for these sorts of interventions. But lots of your other interventions had pretty homogenous groups. And I don't know if that was by design or just circumstantial. And I'm wondering if you could speak to benefits and potential risks if there are any, of diversity in group-based interventions for social exercise.
That's a fabulous question. Even if we take it to in the context older adults and physical activity, I know for example the YMCA, when we brought the idea to them, is that they don't want to segregate or separate and provide disparate opportunities that people are missing out. And the way we pitched it to them is that people aren't sticking with programs because they feel either a lack of comfort or and so it was simply a question is, will people stick with it more so if we set groups up in a different way? And so it was set up as based on theory, a research question, and the data seemed to support that when certain identities are harnessed, we didn't exclude, for example, on that study, on the basis of income status, we cover the costs of those. There was a real variety. If you look at the demographics in terms of, so we cover the full spectrum. I mean, Vancouver's a very affluent place, and so there was a real concern if we just try and model and deliver programs to those such as West Vancouver. But by opening things up, and income wasn't a salient issue. Age seems to be, especially for older adults, and it seemed to make a difference. And so I am mindful there are challenges with that, and especially, I mean, these things can get weaponized, and not to get get too political with this, but we see this south of the border right now in politics. We'll probably see it in Canada shortly as well. It depends on the level of abstraction and the groups to which we're appealing. And so if it's us as we're all in this together, I think the Salman Musa paper is an amazing piece. I think there are a couple of pieces that are probably worth elaborating on. One is that the effects are primarily restricted to within the sport context. They also looked at how might this affect attitudes to others outside of that sports setting, and they didn't have much of an effect. And my take on this is that it's probably a bit of a dose issue. If you have, restriction over the course of one soccer season, but you then flip it to this becomes a habitual thing. You're frequently interacting with people who are different, and then you're appealing to a higher level of abstraction to us as humans, us as Iraqis, or us as Canadians, or in the States, us as Americans. You're probably going to have a greater success. But as soon as we start really weaponizing the othering, and that's why I think, I didn't go in extensive detail with the challenges, but it does come with nuance, and we have to be careful with that. But it's a really great question, and it's one that I continue to wrestle with.
Thanks, Mark. I see hands starting to come up, and apologies if I mispronounce anyone's name. In the top left of my Hollywood square, is that Annalene Conklin?
Yeah, thanks, Al. So I'm Annalyn Conklin. I'm in the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences. I'm an associate prof, and my research area does touch on social relationships, but in the context of cardiovascular risk for women. And I was really curious about what you shared, and I had some observations where I think there might be some really interesting future research questions. I did notice that I thought it was interesting with the age-specific physical activity in a general sports context where they were all kind of white men or white older women. The question would be, when does age group identity matter for a specific type of physical activity versus the veterans together who were mixed age, still also fairly white? So there's sort of an interesting piece around that, I think. When does which identity actually matter, and for what context? I think that would be an interesting next step. And
I'll try each of those questions if that's.
Could I say one more thought?
Of
Mark?
course.
Super. I do some work with Indigenous First Nations, and the elders have spoken a lot around the importance of intergenerational events and activities. So I think from an Indigenous perspective, I think it would be quite different to think about the importance of mixing age. So, and then most of your age-based programs, again, were quite Western white. So I think that might be an interesting piece to explore if there's cultural safety for other ethnicities where mixed age might actually be the goal. So those are my thoughts, Mark.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for sharing. The first is, so the trial we did, it wasn't a uniquely white population. So the slide I put up was based on a program operating in West Vancouver that they set up, they designed before, and I wasn't even aware it existed. So they invited me to come in and have a look. So I listened and learned, and one of my students then took part in the program for a couple of months. But I was interested, to what extent does it generalize when you're looking at a more diverse population on the basis of ethnicity, income, and so on? And so the trial was directly reflective of the population of Vancouver, which is very multicultural. So I think just to pass that piece up, in terms of commenting on Indigenous work, I defer to those who have expertise on. I'm mindful of the old adage, sort of nothing about us without us, and I haven't done work with Indigenous groups. I don't profess to have expertise. I think more broadly, the social drivers do make a difference in terms of, and it's not to say you can't do cross-generational, cross-age group pieces. I mean, there's a lot of lesson that's conveyed. If you look at cultures across the planet, there's a lot of important information that's conveyed, and cross-generational work. I mean, even from a family systems perspective, we have multi-generational families, and so there are different ways of intervening. And so maybe on that, it's probably worth noting, I'm not suggesting this is a magic elixir or fix for life across every context and setting. There are different ways that we can go about intervention, and one can do family systems work. So I'm doing some work with Ryan Rose at the University of Victoria, and we're doing family-based identity work. So it is cross-generational. So we're trying to pick the unit of abstraction is, rather than me and I am an exerciser and I'm now aligned with this group, the level at which we're pitching this is we're an active family, and our identity, we're trying to see if we can promote or support the development of family-based social identities. So I think there's a potential to look at this in different ways, but your point is well taken. But I defer to you and others that do work in the Indigenous space. I mean, I think we all have a lot to learn from there, so I'd be reluctant to offer comments on that one.
Robert Beauchamp? Again, apologies if I mispronounce anything.
That's fine. Hi, Robert Bushell, School of Kinesiology. Thanks, Mark. Really interesting talk. You had talked a bit about some of the biological responses, specifically blood pressure. I'm wondering, in your models, linking back to the introduction of your talk, where precision medicine is often conceived within sort of biological measures, and given some of the work in the center around, say, epigenetic changes that may be linked to social determinants, have you considered some study design constructs that may include both some of those measures as well?
So we've considered them. I mean, this is why I think these sorts of talks are great, because if folks are interested in doing this, let's connect further. We have tried to pitch for funding to try and look at with some of the work Eli Putterman and others have done, looking at in terms of stress responses and telomerase and telomere lengthening, and to see if we can actually get under the skin of folks, but really through physical activity promotion. So we're not suggesting that social identities would have a direct effect on those biological markers, but I think what we'd hypothesize is that we can use these social identities and harness them so that people stick with and retain in programs. And if people are more active, and there's a fair bit of data in that, the exercise physiologists and medical folks will point to this, if you stick with a program and your adherence is good, you'll generally derive those physical benefits, which will get at some of those biomarkers that you're highlighting. I'm not a physiologist. I'm not an epigeneticist. I know I can see two right in the window right now, so I'm reluctant to comment at length on that. I think it's fascinating, though, is that if we can harness those social identities to promote these behaviors, to what extent does it cascade into thereafter downstream effects on human biology, and mental health, well-being, and so on?
Rob, you beat me. I can't figure out how to raise my hand. So I had exactly the same question for Mark. So.
I was thinking of you, Mike.
Thank you. And disclaimer, I'm Mike Cobor's PhD student. I'm Hannah Ruth. So I work on epigenetic age. That's my specialty. So I had that interest as well. But I have a question. You mentioned this was a study done in the YMCA in the Greater Vancouver area, and it was a mixed group. And I was just wondering whether any kind of mixed socioeconomic status mediated any affiliation to the group identity, or whether that was not as much of an effect as being part of a group.
We have the data. We haven't looked at it, and it was 3 different sites. So not just downtown. There were, I forget the names of them now, but 3 of the major YMCA. So we have the data, and what we do have is the data are representative of the older adult population in Vancouver. So, I mean, if there's interest, I mean, we can absolutely look at it. We have the data. We haven't looked at it. I mean, we tried to, especially in the age of open science and so on, we pre-registered what we thought were our theoretically informed hypotheses. And then so that's where we drew from the cohesion piece. We also looked at things like affective judgments, the extent to which people might enjoy those classes. So those were our a priori pre-registered hypotheses. Now, that's not to say there are other mechanisms that may be at play. We do have data set if you're interested, and I'm happy to chat further. And I think we will always love continuing to learn and about what might be going on. So if there are other things at play, it'd be great to chat.
There's a comment in the text box by Catherine Fernandez. What made you interested in this line of research? So personal journey question.
Oh,
How did you get involved in this interesting line of research?
I say hopefully not bore you all to tears on this, but this was totally a serendipitous piece. So I did my doctoral work was in group process, but it was in sports psychology. I was doing everything sport, and then I saw these papers coming up that were referring to older adults who were reported finding that older adults wanted to be by themselves. And I just before I delved into the data, I just thought it was curious because, you know, based on other literature I'd seen, it didn't seem to stick with me so much, because there are obviously consequences to this if older adults do it. And I should say, of course, there are some that do prefer, you know, solitary alone context. But if that's the consequence, if we think of sort of consequential validity, then the obvious route is developing personalized at-home programs which are not devoid of, but are primarily based on individual involvement and not a social setting. And then so I ran this as a total off the side of my desk study. Which we published in Annals of Behavioral Medicine, that got a fair bit of media attention, and then a bit of academic back and forth between myself and the group at Stanford. And then so it just piqued my interest, and we found this observational finding around preferences. And then just, I think, as a scientist perspective, I thought, well, that just tells you about preferences. That doesn't that doesn't tell you at all whether it actually makes any difference with whether people will stick with it. So I went down this very long rabbit hole that's now been over 20 years. Started looking at observational data. We looked at archival data and the extent to which people stuck with programs, you know, when they were, you know, if and when they were more similar versus dissimilar to others. And then the strongest test to my taking was running this as an RCT, where we're sufficiently powered, and of course you need funding to do this. And so that sort of took me down this rabbit hole. And so having gone down the older adult piece, and then that sort of spurred other ideas with different populations. So thanks for the question, and yeah, that's it. Has your journey been successful? In some ways. I failed in many ways, and I can speak at some length if we want. I don't know if that's a yes/no binary question, or we want to go and have some, you know, counseling for Mark here as I share my labors. So I think we've had some success. I think a few pieces I think is worthy of note, though. I think I am a really strong proponent, advocate of the open science piece, open data, pre-registration, and so on. And I know many of us, many at UBC, both campuses will be as well. And it's also been interesting. I think to me, it points to the adage: you ask an interesting question, you get an interesting answer. It might not be the one you expected. I mean, going into that study with the older adults in the GOAL trial, I actually thought going in that, you know, when you provide separate opportunities, especially for older adult women, maybe they would stick with it more so. And we didn't find that. Gender did not matter for that group, which actually practically makes it easier to run programs. You just put them all together, you know, and there's no sort of worries about stuff going on or impression management. It's just, hey, we just want to take part in exercise, and there's going to be a variability in abilities. And so to me, that was an interesting one. We learned, we didn't, you know, wasn't a part of the hypothesis wasn't supported, but another aspect of it was. And so I think we've had some trials. I think that was a success in many ways, but we also try to do this I think in the pandemic as well. We, you know, put this acronym, Seniors COVID Pandemic and Exercise Trial. We thought it was going to be great, and we're going to because by virtue of doing it online, we get lots of people, and our only means of advertising was through the media. And we got some coverage in the CBC and elsewhere, but it was right at the time that there were some pretty major global events and riots and protests. So it was hard to get the word out. It was a reasonably powered study. We had 240 adults, but no difference for older adults, you know, in groups, online groups, than in person. I thought it would make a difference. I think we're all recall from that period in life, we're all trying to stay connected. We're told about the importance of checking in with others, stay connected. And we thought that this group-based exercise where they would connect, and we had this relatively new tool of Zoom would help us. And it didn't make a difference, that, you know, the group versus the individual. So it's a context piece. So on the one hand, it's a failure because our hypothesis wasn't supported, but I think it's also points to why it's important to publish these sorts of data, because it will save people time and money moving forward as well. So I think, so to your question, has your journey been successful? I think I've had some successes. I'd say relatively modest. I'm mindful of the community of folks that are on this call who have had some extraordinary levels of success. So I think I know my place, and which is I'm doing okay, but I think that's about it.
So on that note, I'm going to pass in a minute to Michael Kabor to make some closing remarks, but I'll just make one quick one. That was outstanding, and really appreciate everyone's insightful comments in the discussion, and an excellent topic that is just as germane for those of us who study children as to those of us who study healthy aging. Over to you, Dr. Kabor.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Cohen. I can only echo your words, Mark. Thanks so much. Really fascinating talk. Really much appreciated that you made the effort to bring this life course perspective into your presentation, and, you know, obviously making us think a lot about how we can do things better, differently, moving forward, and how we can, you know, use the kind of work and presentation you've done to build these wonderful linkages between the two Leong centers in Toronto and Vancouver. So thanks so much. And I think the quality and engagement of the questions just was a clear indicator of how much your talk reached folks across the spectrum, from, you know, those of us who think very molecularly to those of us who think policy level. So really beautiful way to start the fall season of the joint Leong Centre speaker series. So thank you so much.
Great,
Really
thanks so
appreciate
much.
it. Okay, everyone have a wonderful day, and we see you for the next joint Leong series speaker series, whenever that might be. Big shoes to fill now.